So Penn Wharton rescored the backdoor Green New Deal legislation that the big guy, Mr. 10%, President Biden, and his flacks call the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, what is it, 300 billion or 300 million?
They've rescored it to triple the spend that would be associated with it. And, I'm not even going to comment on it. Just listen to White House spokeswoman KJP's spin in response to that rescoring.
I wanted to ask you about the Inflation Reduction Act. The Penn Wharton budget model just came out, which I realize you probably haven't seen, but it released new cost estimates, previously saying that it would cost $385 billion over 10 years. The new estimate, based on implementation details for the climate provision, is now more than $1 trillion over 10 years. Is government spending a concern for this president?
So look, the higher score reflects, and I did see this report, the higher score reflects that the Joint Committee on Taxation assumption that the Inflation Reduction Act will spur more manufacturing projects and more clean energy deployment than when JCT originally scored the bill. That is a good thing. It means more private sector investments, more American manufacturing, more jobs, more secure supply chains, and lower costs for American families thanks to cutting-edge technologies. Even with the new score, the Inflation Reduction Act still reduces the deficit over the long run. As you know, I know you follow this very closely outside of the 10 years, right, because it looks at it in a decade. The Inflation Reduction Act increasingly reduces the deficit as time passes, including that second decade, as I was just mentioning, and beyond. So moreover, a number of experts have said that the CBO likely underestimated the deficit reduction from the Inflation Reduction Act's crackdown on rich tax cheats. An expert from the Treasury Department, two former IRS commissioners, and Treasury secretaries say the law's provision to make the wealthy pay what they already owe will reduce the deficit by more, even hundreds of billions more than CBO estimates.
You got that? So
She was reading from a book, right?
she was reading from Joe Biden's cheat sheet,
Right.
that he uses to interact with
right.
LA Times reporters. Yes, I guess Paul Krugman or somebody wrote that gobbledygook so she could read it. So so it's going to cost 3 times more than originally projected, and that's good news because that means more private investment. Well, if that meant more private investment, then why would we be spending 3x tax dollars as what was projected? Oh, it's going to spur more interest in rent-seeking businesses to be underwritten by the federal government. Is that what you mean? And now we're moving from, in the long term, it's going to result in deficit reduction because of all the productivity it generates and the taxes it throws off and jobs created and the taxes those throw off. Right. But now you're pushing back when that deficit reduction allegedly occurs from the first decade to the second decade. But this is all good news. No, of course it is. It's always good news. It's always good news when we expand government. For more on this, pleased to be joined by David Drucker, senior writer for The Dispatch, author of In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. David Drucker, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good to be here.
So, do I have that about sussed out, the administration's position as dutifully recited by KJP, that when legislation costs 3 times more than projected, that's a good thing because it means that there's going to be more government partnering with more rent seekers?
Yeah, well, look, politicians in Washington always find a way to spin how spending money is going to save you money. And that's been true on both sides of the aisle over the past decade or so, if not longer. The truth is, in my analysis and my reporting, I don't really think there's a constituency for less spending and smaller government. There is a constituency, obviously, for a strong economy that is not saddled with high interest rates and inflation. And I think to the extent that Republicans can win an argument that the president's social spending agenda or spending generally is causing inflation and causing higher interest rates, then that's an argument they can win winning an argument simply on the notion that a bill that is going to do things that poll well individually, costs a lot of money, is going to be a harder argument to win, and has proven over the past couple of years to be a hard argument to win.
Are they winning the argument on the debt ceiling after passing the McCarthy plan in the House and McCarthy challenging the Senate and the president to either move their own product or sit down with him and negotiate?
Well, that's to be determined. It was important that House Republicans passed this bill, and you have to credit McCarthy and his leadership team for getting something across the finish line, because the president had laid down a marker that there's no point in me negotiating with you if I don't know actually what you want. And I think that aside from the politics of all of this, look, if you're going to demand the president do something, you need to tell him what it is you want him to do. So now it puts Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and President Biden in a position where they can't just dismiss Republicans as dysfunctional and not making clear what it is they want in exchange for a debt ceiling hike. And we'll see where this goes from here. The danger always is, and we have seen this over time, regardless of which party was instigating this sort of thing, is that while voters are concerned about the debt generally as a question, and as I just said, really more concerned about the impact of the debt, not necessarily the debt itself. But you'll ask them, is the debt too high? Yes, it's too high. Should something be done about it? Yes, something should be done about it. They usually find the notion of holding the debt ceiling as leverage for spending cuts to be an illegitimate form of political combat. It's something that I think would be more effectively done in the appropriations process. In other words, the government spending process, particularly because if the government shuts down, it may bother people and annoy them and cause a lot of inconvenience, but it's not catastrophic, right? A default on the debt for the money we have already spent that we owe would damage U.S. credibility around the world, could hurt the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, which would be a major, major problem for our economy. And so this is going to be a very tricky negotiation, but Republicans are in a much better position because now they can say, listen, we're telling you what we want, so tell us what you don't like about it.
Before I'm going to talk about POTUS politics here, before we get to the Republican side, where there's clearly more action, with Biden's announcement this week, is it really a consolidation of support for his candidacy come hell or high water, or will vultures like Gavin Newsom continue to circle because you never know?
Well, I mean, look, in politics, you're kind of on constant vulture status because if you're at a high level in politics, you're ambitious and you want to get places. I would say that Biden has command of the party. He defeated Donald Trump in 2020. He passed a lot of legislation that satisfied the base of the party, not just the sort of broader elements of the party. And so even though he was never their favorite, he wins. He then produces a lot of legislation that they wanted. And then the party does rather well in midterm elections in which presidents usually come up short and end up getting a revolt of sorts from the voters, right? They gain a Senate seat, only narrowly miss holding on to the House. And so, you have Democrats looking at Biden's leadership of the party, and notwithstanding his age and notwithstanding his approval ratings and all of these, what should be headwinds and are headwinds, they don't look around and see a better option necessarily. Now, look, if he had decided not to run, I think the Democrats do have a bench of sorts. And when you have somebody younger and fresher, you can make a better argument for change. But there's also a huge value to incumbency. And so, you'll see some sniping around the edges, but you always see that. He's their guy unless, there's a health event or something that changes the equation.
So the betting markets have a Biden-Trump rematch at about a coin flip at this point. Is that your handle on it?
Well, look, I mean, when you look at the Republican primary, Trump's the front runner and a strong front runner. And if the nomination were decided today, I mean, the polling is what the polling is, and it's not saying something that's not true. So that's where it would be. I want to see what this primary looks like after some other people actually get into the race and become candidates, and see what happens over the next few months, 3 to 6 months or so. I hate the idea of certainty. I hate the idea of making decisions this far out. I mean, some people forget. You go back to 2015, right, which is the operable comparison here. Before Trump was an actual candidate, he wasn't the front runner. When you looked at polling, he wasn't doing as well as he ended up doing once he became a candidate. Ted Cruz starts the contest at 5% or so when he gets into the race in 2015, and everybody said, "What happened to the great Ted Cruz that was supposed to command the base and all of this?" And he ends up finishing as the runner-up. So there's not always a straight line from here to there. And while Trump is a strong front runner and a commanding figure for all the reasons that we know, he's not quite the same figure he was in 2015, 2016. And so I just want to see how this plays out before I make determinations.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm in the same camp with you. It's interesting to see the candidates trying to feel out a weakness with respect to DeSantis to try to displace him as the alternative to Trump. Now, of course, Trump doesn't feel out weaknesses. He just goes, right for the jugular, and it doesn't matter what his views have been over the years or what his policies were or what his previous statements about a candidate were. Once you challenge Trump, it's you go from zero to nuclear overnight, which is what DeSantis is feeling now. But like a Nikki Haley, trying to poke DeSantis on the Disney thing. What's the sense of where DeSantis has weakness or the possibility that DeSantis could be displaced as the alternative to Trump?
Well, it's a really good question, and I'm kind of, I say this sort of just as an observer, even though, with my reporting, I haven't been able to figure this out yet. I'm perplexed that candidates that are trailing are going after someone other than the front runner. And one of the things that I learned from reporting in Trump's shadow is that, and this is no surprise, but there's a point to it, Republican primary voters want a fighter. It's almost more important than the issues. Not quite, but almost. It's at least on equal footing. And you don't prove to them you're a fighter by not attacking the front runner. If you want to win the Republican nomination, trying to play, some sort of ninth level, some complicated form of chess by knocking out the guy in fifth place and fourth place and second place before you get around to the front runner does not work. We saw that candidates tried it in 2015 and 2016. It did not work. And so treating Trump with kid gloves while beating up on Ron DeSantis, who's not in the race yet, I don't think is going, if you want to win the nomination, I don't think it's going to get it done. It doesn't tell Republican primary voters that you're willing to beat up the biggest kid on the block. And the way they see it, if you won't do that, they don't really trust you to beat up Democrats and the media and everybody else.
And that and that goes for DeSantis too, to some extent, I would argue. I mean, I know he made took the veiled shot at Trump in Utah the other day, where he talked about not outsourcing your executive authority to health bureaucrats during COVID. Obviously, the Trump Fauci reference, but I mean that's veiled. It seems to me the play with Trump, I know they're afraid of the base and they don't want to alienate the base, and the base will never forgive them, and then they won't turn out for them in the general and stuff. But I agree with you. You're banking too many. You're trying to bank shot off too many banks. Why don't you just say, look, Trump did great things. Where I was as a governor and as a congressman before on these issues. I supported what he did on border security. I supported the tax cuts, and he took fire like no one has ever taken, and I respect that and all that. But here's the problem. There were big moments where he made bad decisions, and there needs to be a reckoning for those judgment calls too, because I was in the same, as for DeSantis, I was in those same big moments and I made very different decisions. Why don't you just present the choice straight away like that?
Well, and that's why I'm waiting to see him as a candidate, because I think, well, you and I agree on this, which is, you go after the front runner, you go after him directly, you say his name, you don't make veiled. I mean, it's fine to be a little cute here and there and with a wink and a nod to voters to be entertaining about it, but you have to do to Trump what he does to everybody else. And I'm giving I'm giving DeSantis the benefit of the doubt only in this way. I want to see what he does once he's an actual candidate, which is coming up in a few weeks. He'll announce in mid-May. They moved up the announcement by a month because they realized he's taking on water and they don't have any more time to waste. And let's see if he does that. If he will not do that, if somebody that's viable will not do that, they're going to have a hard time beating Trump. And there's no two ways about it.
He is David Drucker, senior writer for The Dispatch, author of In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. David Drucker, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you.
He joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today.
Dennis Prager here. Sue and I mean it when we say dogs are part of our family, and there's nothing like their loyal companionship. So we provide them with Rough Greens, RUFF, because we want them to feel healthy and be with us as long as possible. I know Charlie Kirk feels the same way.
The Pragers and I couldn't agree more. I rely on my trusted furry friend, Mr. Briggs, who's an absolute machine, and he relies on me